Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the open beta for Mirage Arcane Warfare. This is the upcoming game from the developers of Chivalry Medieval Warfare that will be released on May 23rd. Like Chivalry, it's a first-person hack-and-slash action game, but they also mixed in some magical elements in here, so you have different spells and special abilities that you can use in addition to the various medieval-style melee weapons you got. And at least until I played the beta, this was one of my most look-forward-to titles this year, because I enjoyed the living hell out of Chivalry Medieval Warfare, even though the Deadliest Warrior DLC wasn't very good. And I was curious how they would handle things like the magical elements, as well as improving the base mechanics of Chivalry. Now the thing is, before we get to gameplay, we first have to go through the first impressions, which is the presentation, which for the most part is actually rather well done. Unlike Chivalry Medieval Warfare, where everything was styled very realistically, everything in this is styled very fantastically. There are a lot of magical effects, there's tons of color everywhere, which is greatly appreciated. The blood and gore looks actually somewhat cartoony, and the overall aesthetic definitely brings forth ideas of something like 1001 Nights. That said, the actual visual quality itself is not really anything to write home about. Texture quality is good, but not particularly amazing. The modeling is very well done, but the animations are often rather clunky and seem very sluggish. And then of course the facial animations just look downright goofy a lot of the time. And the visuals being rather stylized really doesn't help all that much in that regard as well, because the faces and characters are actually modeled relatively realistically. It's just that the actual aesthetic is not realistic. But then you move over into sound design and things get a bit better, because you have some really nice meaty, hard-hitting sounds when you're whacking people with swords and maces and axes and things like that, and it ends up sounding pretty great when you're getting into the nitty-gritty of melee. The voice acting is definitely very fitting for what's going on here, because it doesn't take itself very seriously and ends up being really cheesy. So you've got some really corny battle cries, people will scream for a ridiculously long time during those, and then of course there's the sheer amount of shrieking and wailing they'll do when you smack them with your sword or you chop one of their arms off or something along those lines. In which case I would say over the top is almost a bit of an understatement. But that ends up working out pretty well in the game's favor, because this is not a realistic game. The original Chivalry was pretty grounded, but this one is completely over the top in fantasy, so they can pretty much get away with whatever they want as far as making it over the top goes. But then there's the music, which is definitely styled after what you would expect from the sort of 1001 Nights aesthetic, but at the same time it just kind of fades into the background and you barely even notice it most of the time. So even though it is well-made music, you're probably just not going to notice it very much. But of course, what really matters here is the gameplay, because that's what this open beta is all about. It's about getting that game out there in the hands of a large number of players and getting them testing and making sure everything works. And as far as I can tell, there's no single player to speak of, so there's really not much in the way of storyline here. So the real question becomes, what's the gameplay like, and first off, is it any good, and what are the issues they need to iron out by the time the game comes out? Well, obviously the game does still have some technical problems to deal with. It is a beta after all, and you will notice a few things here and there, like some occasional frame rate hitching, some occasional textures not loading in, particularly on the character customization screen for some baffling reason. And while I never noticed the frame rate dropping below playable levels, I did notice numerous frame rate drops throughout the course of my time playing the beta, which is not a particularly good thing this close to release. And while I certainly know that my PC is no longer top of the line, it's definitely good enough to handle this particular game and what it dishes out. The problem is that it's just not all that well optimized. I did notice numerous players with lower end rigs than mine reporting performance problems, but I also noticed it with people who actually have higher end rigs than mine as well, so I'm not really sure if I just got lucky or if they just got unlucky, but something was causing performance problems and they need to fix that. Because a game like this is not something that should remotely tax your hardware to any significant level, considering how small scale it is. Now, of course, once you get past the technical problems and the performance issues, what are you dealing with? Well, you're dealing with basically Chivalry Medieval Warfare, but with magic. The basic mechanics from Chivalry are still there. You still have 3 basic attacks, which are your horizontal and vertical slashes, as well as a thrust, and you also have the ability to parry. Like in the original Chivalry, parrying is not something that is just a static guard that you hold up, it's actually something you have to time. So skill actually does play a fairly significant factor in the melee department. The problem is that these mechanics have not actually been improved since the original Chivalry, which came out 5 years ago. You would hope they would have improved it, make it faster paced, make it smoother, but it's just as slightly clunky as it was in Chivalry, meaning that it is really easy to hit your own teammates, it's still really easy to just get into an uninterruptible attack animation that is too slow, and you still have the problems where it looks like you should be able to parry something, but for some reason the game doesn't register it as actually parrying. And of course, like Chivalry, you still have the problem of people who have absolutely no idea how to actually play the game, going in and flailing around like morons until eventually they accidentally wipe out their entire team while trying to swing at one particular person. Now, it wouldn't have been a problem if they had used that as a base and then improved on the system by giving you more options for attack, maybe giving you some diagonal slashes in addition to the horizontal and vertical ones, or maybe giving you more ability to feint or any number of things like that. Unfortunately, they didn't, however, and it actually ends up being a bit less refined than Chivalry's melee combat is, which is actually kind of surprising. And I think part of the reason for that is they actually put less emphasis on the melee combat this time around and more emphasis on the special abilities that each character has. There are 6 character classes, each of which has their own selection of weapons and their own selection of special abilities. You get 3 slots for your special abilities, and for each slot you have 2 options. So to give you an example, one of the classes has an ability where they can launch forward with a spear attack that goes at a much further distance than the normal spear attack, or they can fill that slot with the ability to send out a sort of magical shield attack. This does mean you get some degree of variety with each of the individual classes. You can customize them to something that suits your individual playstyle a bit more, the problem being that a lot of the abilities are actually rather weak, and you end up just going for one particular ability over the others anyway because there's not really any reason to use that other ability. A prime example being that spear attack. Why would you do that when you can have the shield attack, which goes out further and does more damage? I mean, you can make an argument for using one of the heavier, slower weapons because at least it does more damage, but for things like the magical abilities, it's pretty clear-cut what you should choose when you're going to select a specific class. Now, each of these abilities does have a cooldown period, so whenever you use them, it will display a timer showing you exactly how long it'll be until you can use that ability again, and you can actually lower that timer by collecting the Souls of the Fallen. Or at least that's what I'm calling them for the purposes of this video, because I actually forgot what they call them in-game, and it's something I'll have to correct whenever I end up doing a review on this. At any rate, the game basically incentivizes you being in the fray by giving you the ability to pick up those various souls to decrease your timers so you can spam more abilities. And therein kinda lies the problem, because you've got the base Chivalry melee component that's slightly less refined, and then you have these special abilities that are clearly supposed to be the star of the show, but they actually end up being more annoying than anything else because in a lot of cases you can just straight up block the abilities by parrying. Similarly, the one class you get that actually has a ranged attack is rendered pretty much useless because it is so pathetically easy to block incoming projectiles. Well, if you can see them anyway. Because getting ganked from behind is something that happens all the time in this game and actually gets really annoying after a while. But to be fair, that was a problem with the original Chivalry as well, so it's just something kind of inherent in the game's design. But I digress. The magic abilities do add a different level of gameplay than what you're used to from Chivalry Medieval Warfare, but they definitely still need to do a lot of tweaking before those really start to fit in, because as it stands, they feel like they're kind of tacked on to the Chivalry melee experience, and they're really not particularly great abilities. In fact, several of the classes are just flat out better than the other ones because their abilities are just better than the other ones. One of the classes has an area effect fireball spell that ends up being practically useless because the area of effect is basically the shoulder width of a single person. And then on top of that, it has a really long cooldown, so even though it does a good amount of damage, there's pretty much no way you're ever going to get any kills with it because, let's face it, something with that small of an area and effect is not going to be useful. And when other classes have similar problems, you find that playing the game is actually a pretty frustrating experience simply because you can't really get into the groove of using a particular character because their abilities are just flat out weaker than some of the other classes you'll run into. And unfortunately, it's not even a matter of, well, this particular character has certain really strong uses because they don't really work all that well. So the abilities are definitely something that they really need to fix by the time the game comes out, otherwise it's just going to come across as a poorly implemented mess that just makes the game a hell of a lot spammier than it already is. But I think what's ultimately going to kill this thing is the fact that the melee combat is basically unchanged from the original Chivalry, except that it's just slightly less refined in its current state. Like I said before, Chivalry came out 5 years ago, and the fact that we've seen basically no real progress in that melee system since then is disheartening. Especially when the addition of the magical abilities makes that melee system a bit less relevant, since you've got a lower skill ceiling now. Because it's not like there's been any real innovation in the game modes. I mean, you have a just basic capture the points until eventually you get enough points to win, and you've got a couple of modes where you can go in and do some team deathmatch, or you can go in and complete some objectives, but that's the same kind of stuff we saw in Chivalry. It's just with a magical theme now. And even though the map designs are certainly very fitting to their new aesthetic, they're still relatively similar to what we saw in the original Chivalry. They do seem to be a bit more cramped this time around though, but that might just be a result of only having access to a few maps during the course of the beta. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that one. But overall, the word I would just sum up Mirage Arcane Warfare with is disappointing. It's not a bad game outright, but it's definitely very disappointing coming from Chivalry Medieval Warfare, which is frankly just a better game because everything fits that a lot better. Here it seems like they just took the base of Chivalry Medieval Warfare and said, how are we going to put magic in it? And somebody just went, I know, let's just make them cooldown abilities. And thus the whole thing just comes across as a missed opportunity. I mean, they even have the missed opportunity of the customization options where they kept it being level-based unlocks rather than being something, say, you could unlock through challenges, or maybe just even giving you a fairly decent selection right at the beginning to use instead of just giving you only one option for each class and then gradually unlocking them over time. But no, instead they just stuck with making them all rank-based unlocks like a fairly generic online game these days, so that ended up being rather disappointing. They ended up playing it a bit too safe and sticking too closely to the original Chivalry, and what you end up with here is something that, while definitely having potential, really does need more work to be something truly great. And they certainly won't be able to pull that off a week before the game comes out. So while they certainly will have plenty of opportunity to fix various bugs and glitches as well as performance issues, they won't really be able to do much about the real problems the game seems to have, which are in the core mechanics. Which ultimately makes the whole thing actually somewhat of a shame, because this thing had plenty of potential, it's just that I'm not really sure it's ever going to get there. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you all in later videos.